challenge for you guys to try taking away a real key message from today, whether that's a curious thought, something you're going to research and want to find more about, or finally, something that's actually going to change your practice, so we have that long-term impact of the CPD sessions. This session is going to be slightly different. It's going to include breakout rooms, so and an opportunity to talk about the session, to be curious about it. So please interact during that. I know sometimes it can be a bit awkward on a Zoom session to do it, but I think actually trying to get the most out of it will be a real good and rewarding experience. Just a little reminder that please try to stay on mute. Feel free to share your cameras as much as possible. And if you do have any questions, please don't be afraid to pop them in the chat. The session today will be recorded, and we'll work out how we're going to send out and circulate that in the future. But today's focus is all about keeping that athlete in the center. And it's probably a theme that also came up yesterday about how do we create those curious athletes who take ownership for themselves. And we're really happy and pleased to welcome Bobat today, who's the performance director at the ECB. And it's one that Craig and I are really excited about. So yeah, over to you, Mo. Thanks for joining us. We're looking forward to this.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Thanks, Ralph. Thanks for the intro. Yeah, it's great to be with you guys. Really looking forward to it as well. I suppose the first thing I wanted to say is I'm really delighted and impressed that you guys have chosen cricket as your theme for the conference. Obviously had Di on yesterday, me today, and I'm most impressed that you've decided to run it over 5 days like a test match. So really impressed with that. Well done. By way of an intro into the session, I'll put some slides up shortly, but a bit of an intro into the session. When Ralph and Craig first got in touch around speaking at the conference, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the challenges of managing and I guess facilitating player or athlete development when you've got multiple stakeholders involved. A bit like some of the reflection you just talked about there, Ralph, when you've got different types of people involved, everybody trying to contribute and add value, but inevitably it just gets a bit messy, doesn't it? And from our perspective, if we talk about England cricket, we're a national programme, obviously, but we've got 18 first-class counties, which is where that's our talent pool pretty much, particularly when we're talking at the top end of our game. So we can't really do anything to influence player development and programming without real connection and collaboration and alignment with all of the counties as one of our key stakeholders. And that in itself presents challenges. So, when Ralph and Craig were talking about that, certainly that seemed like a strong thing for us to focus on. Connected to that, that dynamic gets even more challenging when you consider transitions. And what I mean by transitions is we're typically getting players who are playing at a certain level and then picking them for a level above that in a new alien environment. And I think that can't be underestimated. I think there's enough research and evidence out there that shows the significance of transitions and how they can be incredibly anxiety inducing. I think for all of us, we can probably all think about some of our own transitions actually. When, I think back to, your first day in big school, when you're year 7 at secondary school, or when you sixth form college, or first day or time at university, first job or proper job, might be when you're cohabiting or living with someone for the first time, or even when you last moved house. Like every one of those transitions evokes a range of emotions in you. And I'm sure, everyone on the call has got their own versions of that. Well, it's no different for a player or an athlete being selected for something and moving to a new environment. And then when you add on top of that, we're typically dealing with developing athletes or developing players who in most cases will probably be adolescents. If they're, if they're pre the age of 25, they're probably adolescents. There's a lot going on. Again, we know about adolescent development. We know that adolescents are typically striving to establish their identity. They're probably heavily driven by peer perception. All of that, as well as a complicated stakeholder arrangement, makes things quite complex and challenging, I think. And the reason I share all that is it's important that we empathize with that. And it's important that, a bit like Ralph said in his reflections, that we're able to park our ego and put players or athletes at the center of our decision making. And I guess that's the purpose that underpins the session we're going to do today. So I think we've got about an hour and a half, or probably just under that now. And I am keen, a bit like in the intro, to make sure that this isn't a presentation from me, that it is a session. And I want it to be a learning session. So, I know what it's like as a delegate on a conference. You can easily just sit there and listen and observe and absorb content. but frankly, if you just want to absorb and download content, you could probably go and read a journal instead of dialing into this. So I think you'll get more out of this if you engage in it, actually, and we'll have a couple of breaks to get curious about a couple of things, to try and have some discussion with your peers or co-delegates, try and reflect on some of your own learning as well, and hopefully by the end of the session have some sort of learning commitment where there's going to be something that impacts on you moving forward. If you don't get to any of that, then I've probably failed miserably, but hopefully we do get to something like that. And we use breaks, and we'll also use a chat function to get through that, and Karen will be on hand to help us with that. So you'll have to stay on your toes because we might fire some questions your way. I'm just going to try and share screens and get into a presentation. So I'll have to check that you guys can see this once I've shared. Thumbs up from Karen, thanks. Okay, so there we go. Look, I thought a good place to start, before we get into some of that detail around the player's best interest, a good place to start would be this fairly busy slide, which is, I guess, a bit of context that would underpin all of that. And this slide in front of you here is, put simply, it's our pathway strategy for the England men's cricket department. And I'll just take you through some of the key information here. Then as I've gone through this, we'll move into some of the more sort of player-centric elements. But to begin with, it's worth saying that our ambition as an England men's cricket department is to become the most respected team in the world. And that's a very lofty ambition. It's not particularly measurable or tangible, but we're okay with that because it's probably a feeling and a perception. And actually, that ambition isn't just to be the most respected cricket team in the world. We want to be the most respected team in the world. So again, it's a fairly broad ambition there. In terms of what do we want to be respected for? Well, there's three key constituent parts, really. Firstly, we want to be respected for having an inspiring culture. And that's having a group of players that are, I guess, relatable and connected to our public and their followership. They do special things on the field and also are good people off the field. And they can be heroes for all of our young fans and spectators to really connect to. So, and much of that is underpinned by a mantra of taking the cap forward and leaving English cricket in a better place than where we found it, and leaving the cap in a better place than you found it when you finished as your time as a player. And we have three core values of courage, respect, and unity that underpin many of our behaviours and actions. So that's kind of the first bit of what we want to be respected for. The second bit is for the strength of our support system. And by that, the support system involves our England management team and the player-facing element of that, of course, but also our pathway and everything that contributes towards developing England players over a long period of time, but also our network of counties and our responsibility as a national governing body to work with counties and to challenge and support them and to value them as part of this journey for a player as well. So, we want to be renowned for having and be respected for having a high quality support system that underpins all elements of player development. And then finally, and probably most crucially, we want to be respected for the quality and consistency of our performances. And given the volume of cricket that we play across formats, I suppose when I say across formats, there'll be people on the call who might not know too much about cricket, but we have Test cricket, which is, as I said earlier, 5 days long. We've got one-day cricket, which the clue's in the title, it's pretty much a day long and it's 7.5 hours. And then we have 2020 or T20 cricket, which is, quite amusingly our shortest format at 3.5 to 4 hours long. So across those different formats, we've got some competitive targets, and you'll see on the far right that our targets at the minute are the T20 World Cups that we've got this year and next year, our ongoing involvement in the World Test Championship and trying to qualify for the finals of that. And then, most crucially for us as England cricket is the Ashes that we've got. Our next Ashes is down under in Australia later this year. And that's obviously a huge target for us. So, we want to be valued for the quality and consistency of our performances across those key strategic priorities. And then what you've got beneath that framing is 7, what I've called, I guess, impact areas. So England winning or players ready being an example of that. So we've got 7 impact areas, and then we've got some impact enablers which help kind of accentuate and magnify some of those and make sure that we deliver on those impact areas. For those people on the call who write strategy, and if you're interested, the reason I kind of went with impact areas is because it's very easy to write a strategy in straight lines and boxes and hierarchies or silos where you might have science and medicine or coaching or whatever. And I've just never really been keen on that siloed operation. I much prefer to have impact areas that clearly signify the things that matter most and where we're trying to make a difference, but in a truly integrated way. So take something like Players Ready. That isn't just a skills coaches element, that has science and medicine, operation, has all elements underpinning that. So each of these impact areas is a real integrated, holistic approach at us trying to make a difference. And I guess these impact areas are how, as a pathway, we contribute to this ambition. And I'll quickly go through some of this. We actually have tactics that underpin every one of these impact areas, and I'm not going to go into that level of depth today, but I will just share a bit of an overview of each of these. And the reason I'll do that is I think it provides good context for some of the player-centered stuff that we'll get into shortly. But if you take England winning as an example, some of my own personal responsibilities in this space are I drive our performance planning. So I work closely with the head coach to try and drive our performance planning so that he can focus on the here and now, yet he can trust that the medium to long-term strategic thinking has been taken care of. So that's a key element of us contributing to England winning over a long period of time. Connected to that, I mentioned our formats earlier. At any given time, we typically have one team competing while another is preparing, because we just play so much cricket across having 3 teams pretty much. So when Chris Silverwood, the head coach, is working with the team in front of him, it's my job and the pathway's job to prepare the next group that he will then take up, and we kind of swap over. So we're always preparing and competing at the same time, which is quite an interesting operational and performance challenge that I really enjoy. And then the other bit around England winning is being really precise with things like our player succession planning. And again, I'll give some examples of that later. Trying to make sure that we don't have gaps in our first team for too long, and we can graduate players into the England environment and induct them when we need it most. If you talk about players being ready or players ready, a big part of that is assessing readiness, actually. So testing out players and seeing how ready they are for the highest level. There's a fairly big gap between our county or domestic cricket and international cricket. And in essence, much of the work that you do in that gap in between is trying to prepare players for international specific challenges, and you need to assess their readiness for that. So that's a key part of what we do. And part of that is exposing them to the England environment. So we try and immerse players in the England environment for a period to see how they cope with it, how they can hopefully have the resilience to thrive in that environment. But another area of emphasis for us is induction and exit into and out of England. I have a personal belief that first impressions and last impressions are lasting impressions, and players typically, they talk about when they were first picked and when they debuted or when they got their first call up, and often they're left with the feeling of when they were eventually dropped or left out, and that was the end of their international career. And I really want us to emphasize the significance of selecting and identifying and inducting well, so that people can thrive quickly and we give them the best chance. But equally, when it comes to the point where someone gets left out, we do that in a really empathetic and sensitive way, because that's never going to be nice, and you don't want to leave them with something that's unsatisfactory, really. And then when we talk about players improving, this one's certainly a real holistic and team approach. Key areas here are us being really individualized and collaborative. And again, I'll give some examples of this with our case studies that we'll get into today. It's trying to make sure that for players to improve with our support as a national governing body and an international pathway, we want to make sure that the things that we do when they're with England are really add value. So we always talk about add value or unique expertise, or add value and unique experiences. And I'll give some examples of that later. What we can't be doing is just simply duplicating what a county does, because there's no point in that, and you're not really fulfilling our role or our end of the bargain. So key bit there is unique experiences, unique expertise. And one of those unique sets of experiences is the opportunity to get players into best versus best environments, particularly at international level, also regional level, but particularly international level. So even that image that you see there is our last Lions tour that we took to Australia to take on the Aussies down under. So Lions is our sort of second team, pretty much our second team level. So that's a good example of how we get the best, in and around the best to compete. When we talk about players thriving physically, it's pretty self-explanatory, really. But some of our tactics in this space is how we use and leverage minimum and aspirational fitness standards to drive behaviour and drive performance improvement. And we've seen a real shift in the way that we've done that, and we're trying to evolve that so that we do move from sort of minimum standards to aspirational standards. A bit like the players improving area, from a physical perspective, we want to be truly individualized where we can, but we also want to prioritize like it's quite difficult for our science and medicine department to provide the level of care that we need to across our whole talent pool. There's so many players involved, so prioritization is key. And in particular, providing support across key functions like strength and conditioning, nutrition, and even rehabilitation. So there's a number of areas or tactics to that. And then bottom left, players and staff thriving psychologically, and you'll clearly see a deliberate emphasis on staff as well. Staff often get forgotten, and I think the significance of staff thriving psychologically is also key. In fact, we have a bit of a mantra where we try and encourage our staff to think about self-care before we think about player care, because if you don't put your own oxygen mask on first, you're going to struggle to help somebody else. So ultimately, that psychological element for us is key. Some of the things that we do in that space is try and conduct comprehensive assessment. So try and get past the real superficial stuff and get a real deep understanding of our people. And then we're well equipped to deliver prioritized support, particularly during some of those transitions. How do we help a player get into an environment and feel settled quickly? Or how do we help a member of staff, even if a member of staff moves up to the England environment or changes environments or does something new? So, it has player and staff elements to that. We have lots of ongoing wellbeing and monitoring elements, which have obviously been tested quite hard during this COVID and the sort of COVID era and playing sport behind closed doors and in bubbles and loads of time overseas. So that's obviously been tested and something that we've had to really focus on. And then, another key element, given the schedule and the amount of cricket that we play, is being really proactive with our player workload programming, but also our staff programming, because, again, if you take from the 1st of January this year through till March next year, which is 455 calendar days, we've got 145 match days during that period, and that's looking at it quite crudely, with each match day as an individual unit rather than a game. But that's equivalent of a match day every 3 days for 15 months, which is incredible. If you add on top of that training days, time away on tour, domestic cricket, it's more than the actual days you've got in the year. It's impossible for someone to do everything. So we've got to be really strategic with deploying our staffing and playing resources. When we talk about strong foundations, much of that is further down the pathway, mainly our, in and around our under-19 programme, but also our regional age group and county academy network. So a key element for us is providing strong direction to our counties. So things like our talent development framework or curriculum in probably the type of language that you guys might be familiar with, our competition structure at age group level, and even some of our county standards that we set for our academies. All of that sits in that space there. We centrally fund all of the county academies, and as part of that, we have certain standards that we have, that we want counties to follow, and we try and make sure that they adhere to those. But we support them through that process, and obviously provide that sort of extra info like the talent development framework and the competition structure. We also want to make sure at a young age we're identifying players with real rigorous evidence, with a rigorous evidence base. Talent ID is basically prediction, and nobody's that good at predicting. So we want to try and make sure that we use as much evidence as possible to underpin some of those sort of selection decisions and sort of predictions. And then ultimately, we want to expose players to international cricket as early as possible, start that journey of bridging the gap. And we want to do that, we start that at under 19 level, and hopefully in time we can make that even younger. And then the final impact area, that insight-led performance advantage, pretty obvious really, but much of that is around our analytics and our research. So, whether we're talking about pre-match or series analytics, or even post-match or series review, we want that all to be evidence-based and well-informed. We want to try and make sure that we critically and objectively inform all elements of our talent ID and our development, and that's through some of our research relationships and collaborations. But then there's also things like presenting data and visualizing data and our digital systems that are absolutely critical, so that we can arm our decision makers with information that's automated and agile. And then finally, when I talk about impact enablers, what are some of the things that help us to deliver on these impact areas? There's a few things. Firstly, we really want to have a diverse workforce, and I mean diversity of perspective, probably more than anything else. We want cognitive diversity as well as all the other elements of diversity that provide a richness to an environment. But we want a group of people that are really hungry to grow, and an environment where learning and progress is normal. So a diverse mix of people and perspective really helps us to achieve that. We want to make sure we've got close connection to all of our counties and our other ECB departments. And as well as that, through everything we do, we want to make sure we deliver with high quality operations and admin. And then finally, we want to make sure that our performance centre is an inspiring space where players and staff can spend their time and be motivated and engaged to deliver on this ambition to be the most respected team in the world. So look, I'm conscious I've been talking at you for a fair period there, but hopefully that gives everybody on this call in this session a bit of a feel for certainly my leadership, hopefully, but also the strategy that myself and my department are working towards and how we are trying to deliver on being the most respected team in the world. As a bit of a break from me talking, I'm going to be quite ambitious now. I'm going to try and play a video actually, and well, it's quite a long video actually. It's about 10 minutes long, but I think it is engaging, and I think it will keep you all through those 10 minutes. And the purpose of this is to really bring to life our strategy with some visual, because I could talk about it all day, but I think it's really nice for you guys to get a bit of a feel for what this might look like in reality. This video is actually a resource that I had put together when we were still formulating our strategy, and I was working with all of our staff to try and understand, well, what are we going to do and how are we going to do it, and what we're really going to believe in, what are some of those impact areas going to be. And this video has been a bit of a resource that we're able to, once we got through that process, early stages, I shared it with a lot of our staff and to give them a bit of a feel for what we were trying to achieve and the vision that we were working towards. So I'll play this, and then after that, we'll start to get into some of the more player sort of centric elements.
It makes me excited.
For me, it's been brilliant.
Been fantastic. It's hugely valuable.
It was a massive boost for me.
Unbelievable experience.
Thoroughly enjoyed it.
No stone unturned.
Best feeling I've ever had on a cricket field.
It's amazing to see.
It's priceless. Mind blowing.
Assault of the senses.
Nope, never been anywhere close.
I think it's very exciting to be here.
It's been brilliant.
You see with the smile on your face, things are going pretty well.
It's gold dust.
What we settled on was the most respected team in the world. You're not going to be the most respected team in the world if you're not winning.
One of the things is it gives selectors and coaches the opportunity to see players wearing an England shirt in conditions which are, we hope, very similar to the type of conditions they would play in if they were playing for England.
We're preparing the next in line, and that's all of their skills and their whole game. That's their technical, tactical, physical and psychological game, and also them as characters and people, so that when they get into the England team they can thrive as quickly as possible.
We're now exposing these guys to conditions before it becomes a surprise when they get selected.
It's wearing the kits, and it's interacting with a large support staff and management team. It's playing at grounds like this at the MCG. It's flying around the world. It's being in a hotel. It's all of those things that go with the England and the international environment. I think that's really important.
You're trying to put experiences in the way of players, and some of them will turn out to be very useful.
It makes me excited. Looking forward to the future. Hopefully there's a number of guys in this line setup that will be featuring for England soon.
Your skill, I think, gives you the opportunity to develop your character.
Making sure that players are coming through with strong foundations, and that's working closely with their counties to develop those foundation skills.
Don't be scared to reinforce the basics and the simple things, that to do them really well, because at the end of the day, they are the things that keep you safe when the pressure's on, and we all know in international cricket the pressure is at its highest point.
It's finding those characters that can thrive in what can be quite a hostile environment at times, pressurised. There's a lot of scrutiny on you, and players that are ultimately able to keep their mind and focus on what's in front of them, rather than worrying about the big wide world outside of it.
Practice different skills. Listen to your coach. I mean, you might not always agree, but they do know what they're talking about.
I think one of the the best attributes a coach can have is trying to nurture someone's natural talent.
You've got to understand the player, or try and understand the player and get to know him. The whole camp's been very individualised, so it's actually very rare that you get a player one-on-one for that amount of time. So for me, it's been brilliant. We've got to work on really good specifics. Some people have come into the camp already knowing where they want to improve and spoken to their county coaches. They've given us a few ideas of how we can move them forward.
It's been an unbelievable experience to work with different players in a different environment. And it's the ability to forge those relationships really quickly and to try and have an impact without intruding.
So being the only keeper, hearing that Bruce French is coming out is a really positive thing. I worked with him at Loughborough the last couple of weeks. And I really enjoy this style of coaching. One wicket keeper, James Bracey, who's was the reason that I went there to work with him on his keeping. First time I really worked with him, apart from a little bit at Loughborough, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Having Erap has been fantastic. Things that he's talked to me about in 3 days, I've learned from him already, which has been fascinating for me. So it must be absolutely amazing for our young spinners to get one-on-one time with him.
Getting someone like him who really understands it, it's gold dust, especially for someone like me, young spinner who's still learning his trade massively.
It seemed to be part of a range of experiences that had helped Dom to arrive in a good state for that South Africa tour.
We were feeling positive about the journey that he was going to go on, and we probably still didn't predict it would go this well, this quickly. But he, it is a great case in point of how an individualised programme can hopefully prepare him for England's needs.
All that hard work has come good, and I couldn't you couldn't write a script really.
To make sure that we're close to England, and that everything that happens from a pathway perspective is connected to England. And that might mean supporting players that are deselected from England to help them bounce back.
By looking at yourself and knowing that you can get better, knowing what reasons you are being held back with, knowing how to get better as well, and then trying to pick different guys' brains. I mean, yeah, you've got Dawes and Vic.
Development in sport, in life, is not linear. You don't just get better at the same pace in an even line.
The guys have been great, and it's also nice sometimes to have a few extra ears that I can bounce a few ideas off and see what they say.
We want to make selection as close as possible to the knowledge that you guys have. I think players have brilliant knowledge of their peers and their contemporaries, and we tap into that all the time.
It's a massive, inclusive, good, warm feeling to know that you're also being talked about or thought about, at least behind the scenes.
I was actually told I was a concussion replacement before the Ashes series, before playing a Red Bull game. So I think when I got that call from Ed Smith, to be given that confidence and to know that I was the next batter in at that stage was a massive boost for me. It gave me that extra bit of motivation to, if I got myself in, go as big as I can.
Understanding your fitness has to be brilliant if you're going to tour in Asia, because I personally felt sometimes quite tired even just training. So playing a 5-day test match there would be tough work.
Getting that taste at this camp has definitely motivated me more. I definitely feel a lot more driven.
You get here and you've got a real energy about wanting to do your training, wanting to get out, do your fitness, wanting to get out, do your hard graft, to then hopefully let it pay off when it comes to back in the team.
Players' attitudes to S&C work has really changed. Over the years, people start to realise that just those little changes to fitness levels actually make a big difference to what they get out on the pitch, whether they bowl faster or they bowl the same speed for longer. The benefits are huge, really, if you get it right.
We're very well supported, and that's improved massively.
Preparing squads that aren't currently with England, so some of the specialists that are at home, if the T20 team are away with England and the Test guys are at home, then it's making sure that we provide support for those guys so that as squads change over, players arrive in a really good place.
Like I say, I think I'm really looking forward to this tour, and it makes it even more special when you get yourself back from injury to be able to perform for England.
Well gone. Beautiful from Wood. He's got him an edge. Mark Wood has 5 for. What an outstanding performance.
If you grab it with both hands, then surely you can realise where you could be in the next 3 years.
When I was at Yorkshire, I was an 18-year-old lad. I mean, there's not many 18-year-olds that haven't made mistakes. But now, along the way, I've learned, I've picked up things off certain people. I've worked closely with Chris Jordan at Sussex, who's a great role model. And then to work with Jimmy has been sort of mind-blowing. To work with someone of his experience and everything he's done over the years, it's been special for me to work with him.
I watch Joe Rue every day, and all of them, Joss, the way, and Stokes, the way they train physically, and Joe, the way he trains in the nets. There's just, no stone unturned.
We feel invested in the journey that we're taking players on, and we have this mantra of taking the cat forward.
They were almost running the show, making sure the culture was right, and I stepped right back into it, and I felt right at home. Almost felt like I hadn't had the 18 months out, which was, I think, a massive credit to them.
It creates a lot of opportunities for guys to sort of get together and build that kind of group unity.
Joe as captain was massive on that, and Stokes as vice captain, they're massive on this culture they're trying to create around the group, and everyone's got a voice. At no point did I feel like I wasn't part of it.
The three key words they go by: the courage, unity, and respect. The ultimate thing is taking the cat forward.
Every day you turn up with a good attitude, you try your best, and we respect everyone and everything around us. And if we do that, we're being good people, and strangely enough, good people often make the best cricketers.
I think it's important that we all buy into that and believe in that, and that we can all leave English cricket in a better place than we found it.
This is the moment. It's Anthony Guptill. 2 to win. Guptill's got to push for 2. They've got to go. It's got through. It's got to go to the keeper's end. He's got it. England have won the World Cup by the barest of margins. By the barest of all margins. Absolute ecstasy for England.
Well, look, hopefully, guys, that video gives a bit of a flavour and I guess a real-time feel for how we try and develop and prepare players for England. I appreciate it's quite a long video. I don't think I do a presentation without playing that clip of England winning the World Cup now anyway, so we might as well get our money out of that moment until the next World Cup. But hopefully that's been a useful, I guess, visual representation for you guys. I'm just going to move in. I've got 2 or 3 more slides, and we're going to get into a bit of a break and some breakout stuff. But I guess when we're talking about preparing players for England, I'm going to get into some examples of how we move towards being, I think, a bit more individualized. And I'll describe a process whereby I think we arrived at a place where we could make decisions in the player's best interests. But it's worth saying that before you do that, before you get to a point of being able to consider the player's interests, you almost need to understand your own needs as a team or an organization. So we started with considering our own competitive needs and what that looked like. So I'll go through kind of, I've settled it down to kind of a 4-stage process, then I'll get into talking a bit more about the players. But for us, the process started with having real clarity and understanding around our own competitive targets. And I guess targets are the Ashes and the T20 World Cup. So that gives us real clarity around what we're striving towards. And we started this process of trying to get really individualized with some of our player development a couple of years ago, so summer 2019. And we knew that going into this phase, that those would be our 2 competitive targets. Once you've got clarity on your targets, you can then move towards giving some real deep thought to what it takes to win. And I know that most of the sports that the people on the call will interact with will have their own version of this. But for us, take the Ashes as an example. We've got a what it takes to win analysis done on Test cricket more generally, and then more specifically on winning in Australia as well. So we've got a bit of a blueprint of how we're trying to compete and what we think it takes to be successful out there. And a good example would be take bowling in cricket as an example. We know that for us to be successful in international cricket, we need a fast bowling attack that's regarded as what they call a varied attack. And by varied attack, we've got some key attributes that need to feature in that attack. And we've kind of got some pretty precise thresholds for what those attributes need to look like. One example would be having at least one bowler that bowls with what we would regard as extreme pace. And one of the examples I'll get into with one of the players shortly will be a good example of that. But that what it takes to win analysis is key. Once you understand what it takes to win, certainly from our perspective, we invested some time in really thinking deeply around what our selection needs were going to be. So almost 2 or 2.5 years out from our competitive targets, trying to project forward and think, right, what do we think the makeup of our team or squad is going to need to look like? What is the core of that team that's in place now? Where do we think we've got some gaps? Where might someone's career be peaking and they're going over the hill or even retiring, and where might you have gaps that emerge? All of those things were the types of things we try to model and predict, so we could be really clear on our selection needs. And don't get me wrong, there'll be some needs that just stay consistent over time. Like a good example would be spin bowling. You know, the way cricket is played in this country, we don't have a history of developing lots of spin bowling depth. So that's always going to be one of our needs. But there's other areas where they're emerging needs just because someone retires or moves on or whatever. But understanding your selection or recruitment needs are key. And then finally, giving real thought to the talent pool of players that are capable of meeting those needs. Basically, who's going to fill those gaps? And we did a huge amount of work, and we've invested quite heavily in our talent ID processes over the last few years. But information from our scouting network, our performance data and analytics, the insight and thinking of our selectors, and making smart decisions really about who we want to invest in. So from our perspective, you know, we invested a lot of time in trying to work out who could meet those needs that help us win and help us deliver on those competitive targets. And in this particular process, back in summer 2019, in this example I'm sharing, we settled on sort of, I don't know, between 10 and 20 players that we thought would have a really good chance of meeting some of those needs. And then clearly, once you understand what our needs are, the attention has to move quickly and importantly to the players' needs. And again, I've probably got a 4-stage process of how we establish that. There's 3 players on the screen here that I'm going to use as an example as we go through today. So on the left, you've got Ollie Stone, who I'll talk about later. He's a fast bowler at Warwickshire. In the middle, you've got Dominic Bess, who's a spin bowler, who was at Somerset, but now currently at Yorkshire. And on the right, you've got Dan Lawrence, who is a batsman at Essex. So we'll talk a little bit more about them after we've had our break in a minute. But in terms of establishing the players' needs, how did we arrive at that? So having worked out who the players are, it started really with me in particular, having conversations with each county. So I talked in the intro about stakeholder alignment. So the purpose here was for me to have a conversation with the director of cricket at every county and to really work at gaining their commitment and their buy-in right from the outset. And the analogy that I give here is, you know, and we've been very guilty of this in the past, but even if you're doing this quite well, what you inevitably are doing with players is you're playing past the parcel. You have a player will be in a county environment. They'll do a really good job of managing them. They'll have a program for them. They'll then hand them over to us. We then do what we want to do with them. Similarly, develop them, progress them, have a program for them, hand them back. And you're always paying past the parcel with players. And the vision, I guess, in this cycle was for us to move from past the parcel to having just one program with different environments. So move away from this element of past the parcel and move more towards one program, one system with just different environments. So I really wanted to get the commitment from the directors of cricket for that. We took that to an extreme in some cases. Take fast bowling. You know, we have central contracts for our main England players, and then the rest of our players obviously we pick from county cricket and they're contracted by their counties. But we introduced, you know, 3 or 4 what we called pace bowling development contracts. Our fast bowlers are key physical assets, and they could easily be mismanaged physically. So we introduced some almost split contracts where we both own the player, for want of a better phrase, even though I don't mean that literally. But you know, players contracted to both the ECB and the counties, and we therefore are forced to collaborate and make sure that one program is delivered with joined up, you know, responsibilities. And that really helped us to try and align around the players' best interests. And I'll talk about that as an example again. What we then did internally was, myself and all of our ECB performance staff, we did internal case conferences on every one of these players to really share our thoughts and our understanding of what do we know about these players, what do we think their development needs are based on our opinion. Almost to get aligned and to get our own house in order first before we start speaking to stakeholders or the player. We then moved to doing external case conferences and collaborating with each of the counties for every one of these players. So in Ollie's case, it was with the Warwickshire's high performance staff, or in Dan's case, it was the Essex guys. But we basically delivered external case conferences with all of those. And I think Ralph or Craig mentioned at the start this concept of being prepared to not be the person holding all of the information and the knowledge, and having some humility in that's something that you've got to do. When we did our external case conferences, it's knowing and appreciating that we might know quite a lot about these players, but in many cases the counties might know even more about them, or at least know different things about them. So we really wanted to benefit from that dialogue and that insight, with a view to, at the end of the case conference, we've all moved towards greater clarity of purpose, intent, alignment, but also role clarity. If a player's on programme across both environments, well, what's the ECB's responsibilities? What's the county's responsibilities? And then finally, and probably most critically, was making sure that we had player engagement and agreement. And people might wonder, well, why have you saved the player bit till last? Shouldn't the player bit come first? And I've got a pretty strong view on this, in that that's not a hierarchy of importance. The players' engagement and agreement is probably the most important thing. But what is important is that when we arrive at having that dialogue with the player, that the system already has an element of clarity and cohesiveness around that conversation. Because if you try and have a conversation with the player around what they think their best interests are and their priorities, they're going to basically respond to the different stakeholders. If they sense that the ECB have a view that doesn't align with the county's view, or for any reason there's any conflict there, that's going to really impact on them negatively. So we wanted to make sure that we had done good preparation before we engaged the player. And what we wanted to do was really understand their motives as players. What is it that they're really, I guess, aspiring towards, trying to work out how we can inspire them and what's going to be the hook that keeps them on track. And that'll be different. They'll have their own unique way, and I'll share some examples of that. We wanted to empower the players so they could really begin the journey of taking ownership for their own development and their own program. Encourage them to be as honest as possible around their development areas and their needs. So for each of these players, I was asking them questions for them to really understand and unpick what do they think they needed to get better at, and how might they get there. And in the case studies we'll go through, I'll share some examples of that. But it's really critical that we came out of that process with a joined up and aligned view of what the ECB, the county, and the player thought and felt were the key priority development areas for each player. And then once you've got that, it's a case of moving into some programming. And I suppose this would be my final kind of slide before we move into a bit of a break. By programming, it's a case of taking those individual development areas for every player and moving towards designing a program that enables them to improve in those areas. And I suppose the biggest shift that we made here was a philosophical one. And anyone who's heard me speak in the last year or two on anything like this will probably hear me use a phrase that I've repeated quite a lot, in that the philosophical shift I wanted people to get and appreciate is what we've typically done, and I've definitely been guilty of this myself, in that we typically design programs and then you pick players or athletes for your program and you try and differentiate it and individualize it for them. That's pretty normal. Well, I set my staff the challenge of thinking about individuals first and program second. And that process that I've kind of guided us through today has been a way of us arriving at the individual and their needs, and then we get into program design. Now that comes with some challenges. Operationally, that's quite tricky. It's a little bit messy. It isn't the way we like to organize. It's not the way we like to budget. All of those things are different, but we really wanted to make sure that we thought individuals first and program second. And to do that in a cricketing context, we had to decouple the competitive team from the development program as well. Like, we've typically picked players for the Lions program, they would have trained and then they would have competed. Well, I wanted to separate all of that and to really think about player development at the heart of it. And then when it came to mapping out their program, we had a few ingredients or constituent parts, really. So we wanted the program to be as player-led as possible. So the players had played a role in driving their own development areas. But in addition to that, what I wanted to do was to get them to think about the how. So a question I asked every single player in those case conferences was, if money was no object and there was no constraints at all and anything was possible, how would you want to get better at your development areas? And some of them needed a bit of help with some creative thinking, and typically people weren't that good at thinking outside the box to begin with, but with a bit of encouraging and facilitating, they managed to think a bit more sort of, I guess, creatively around how they could get better. Obviously, you can't always operate with no constraints because your budget will only stretch so far. But in any creative process, you don't want to start with constraint because then you stifle creativity. So I wanted the players to think as open-minded as they could to begin with. And then ultimately I would be able to tell them, well, we can or can't afford to do that. Let's try and make that happen. But I wanted them to think with an open mind to begin with. The next couple of bits are the bits I touched on earlier, really. Add value experiences and add value expertise. And just to emphasize what I mean by add value again, it's not duplicating. If a player is going to spend time with England, we need to do and provide the things and experiences and expertise that they can't get very easily at their counties. So for us, if you take experiences as an example, the two biggest challenges that an England cricketer faces is probably playing cricket in the subcontinent, so somewhere like India, or going to the Southern Hemisphere, and in particular Australia. They're your big challenges, and the reason for that is cricket is a game of conditions. The game changes quite a lot depending on where you're playing in the world. So exposing players to some of those different environments is one of the key things we can afford to do, and we can do, particularly when you're talking about competing at international level, whether it's under 19 or Lions. When we talk about add value expertise, it's surrounding players with individuals, whether that's current or former players, or even coaches that have a real deep international specific knowledge and experience. And that might even be overseas coaches. There was an example in that video where Dom was talking about a coach, former player and coach from Sri Lanka, Rangana Herath, who's one of the highest wicket takers ever as a spin bowler, and us setting up some time with him for not just Dom as a player but also the coaches was as Dom described, gold dust, because he was able to learn a lot about bowling in those conditions from an expert who had done it, not from one of our guys. So that's really key for us. But also add value expertise might not be that type of stuff. It could simply be just plugging a resource gap. So a county might not have a nutritionist, as an example. Well, we've got one, so let's make sure that we direct nutrition support at that player, because that's a gap that we're fulfilling. We're adding value there. So through this case conferencing process, we tried to do a bit of a needs analysis on every county to plug gaps where it was most required. If they've already got a high level of support and it's trusted support, well, we don't need to double that up. We just need to make sure we collaborate and we get engaged on the same page. But we would center our resources and our expertise in areas where the county needed it most. And then finally, when we're talking about programming and communication, that's an ongoing process, really. Like, you can't design a program and think that player development plan or individual plan is going to be the thing that guides them for the next year or 2 years. That just isn't the reality of learning. Learning is far more messier than that. So programming is a real iterative process. A great example would be, even in the summer right now, take someone like Ollie, who I'll talk about, the fast bowler. Every Monday I touch base with my specialist coach and we talk about how he went last week. He's playing for his county right now, not for us, but how he went last week. We get science and medicine insight. We discuss what we think his program might look like. And then my fast bowling coach speaks to the county's fast bowling coach and they talk about that program. We do that every week. We're iterating and adapting his program. So it's a real ongoing process. And in some cases, they're delicate conversations, because you're talking about when he can and can't play, or when he should and shouldn't play. And so you've got to really build trust and collaborate in that. But the types of conversation you have, there's often decision-making level, where it might be me and the director of cricket talking about, like I said, availability. There might be just practitioner to practitioner collaboration. So my coach talking to the county's coach, or my S&C our S&C talking to the county's S&C, as an example, or even just general information sharing and updating, sharing video clips, sharing insight of how things have gone. But that ongoing communication is absolutely critical. So look, I've tried to share there, if I just do a bit of a summary on what we've done in the sort of half of the session so far, bit of strategic stuff, a video to bring some of that to life, obviously. And then I've tried to take you all through a bit of a process there, how we arrived at being able to really focus on the player's best interests. And it took a lot of work. It was us understanding our needs as a team and as a set of teams. It was understanding the players' needs, and then it was getting into some programming. And I suppose what I'd like to do now is we're going to have a short break. I've deliberately called it a curiosity break. We'll have a short break because it's probably a good time for people to either grab a drink or have a comfort break themselves. And Karen's going to do a bit of magic and get people into some reflection opportunities and some breakout rooms. But what I'd like you to do in small groups, and I think these will probably be 3, 4s or 5s, I don't know, but in small groups, try and reflect on the session so far. Probably discuss anything that might have sparked your curiosity, and just, I've got a real desire to stress here that this doesn't have to be something positive. It could be something that I've said that you totally disagree with. I'm okay with that as well. Like, challenge is perfect in this environment. But I want you to really give some thought to what has sparked your curiosity. If it's something that I've said that really aligns or strikes a chord, and it might be something you want to think a little bit more deeply about or discuss, then go for it. If it's something that you think, I don't really agree with that, this works better for us, but maybe I need to understand it better, well, that's fine too. There's no right or wrong here. But I really want to encourage you, a bit like Ralph and Craig said in the intro, to be curious about something here and to discuss it with 3 or 4 peers in your breakout room. And to benefit from that, probably want to fire those thoughts through on the chat so we can just see some of that traffic. Look, we might have time to focus on a few, we might not, but it'd be really interesting to get a feel for some of the things that people are curious about. So again, just fire those through on a chat for people to be able to read, and hopefully Karen can support with some of that. So I don't know, if we try and give ourselves, let's say 7 or 8 minutes to do that. So, a couple of minutes to grab a drink or whatever, and then maybe 5 minutes worth of just firing some curious stuff at each other and then popping it through on the chat, and then we'll reconnect. And then what I'm going to do in the next half of it is I'm going to just go through 3 case studies. So those 3 lads that I put up on the screen earlier, I'll very quickly go through what their individual programming element looked like, and then we'll finish with a bit more sort of reflection. Karen, Ralph, over to you guys to try and get people into breakout rooms, and probably set sort of 7 or 8 minutes on that for us to get back.
Okay, great. Yeah, sending people in now.
Do I need to do anything on my end, stop sharing or anything?
Nope.
Wants me to join one. Do I need to do that, Karen?
No, you don't. Sorry, it's automatically invite absolutely everyone to join one. So
that's all right. Ralph, if we were talking, will that disrupt those who are in breakout rooms, or will they not be able to hear?
Oh, they won't be able to hear if we're talking. It will be recorded still, unless we can pause. I think we can pause, can't we? We can probably just expand on it rather than Craig doing it.
Whatever suits you.
Yeah.
Ralph, just be mindful of time. That's all. If you start asking, that would be my only thought. Would be that there's 2 questions there. You could ask probably 2 and one of them to do it.
Yeah. Crack on with you then, Craig, and then I'll bring people in from the group.
Yeah, I'll pick the first 2 up most. I'll try and talk to you not.
Yeah, I'm ready when you guys are.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring people back.
Perfect, thank you.
You might need to start recording again as well, Karen.
Yeah, it's fine.
Cheers.
They've got 60 seconds. Come back in.
Thanks, Karen. To Mo, and while you're doing that, if you could pop into the chat any thoughts of curiosity which Mo kind of asked you to do, that'd be great, and then I'll ask to bring a few of you in. So if you pop anything which you found really sparked your interest or sparked your curiosity, it'd be great if you pop those into the chat. Craig?
Yeah, Mo, there's a couple of questions early on around particularly the exiting, so whether that's deselection or exiting from the pathway. This notion of what does that empathy look like on the ground, and I suppose the second one, trying to incorporate that, is what does that empathy look like on the ground, particularly when they've had a bad experience. As positive as you try to make it, there'll be some who leave with a bitter taste in their mouth. Yes, just you could talk to those.
Yeah, good question, and there's a few things that come to mind. The first thing I'll say is it's okay to remember that sort of stuff isn't easy or nice. Right, like just in itself, talking to that and being prepared to acknowledge that is important as a group of staff delivering that messaging, but also for the players. Like, that isn't a nice experience, so you need to appreciate that, and it's not easy. I suppose the second thing I'd say is that there's a bit of a philosophical element to it of how it's positioned, in that I personally believe that in most cases, being left out or exiting doesn't have to be this binary thing that we're all so scared of. And cricket's terrible at this. Like, there's so much stigma around being dropped. And in fact, cricket's probably one of the mainstream sports, probably one of the other sports that still talks in that type of language. In football, you're left out, or you're rested, or you're rotated. In cricket, you're dropped, and it's major news because apparently we should play the same team every game in all conditions, in all formats. Even this winter, where we were quite creative with some of our rest and rotation, we got hammered for it. But it's because we're developing this view and this mindset of that we need a big pool of players to achieve our goals, and therefore multiple players will be involved, and some might play, some might miss out. And it isn't this binary cliff edge of, right, once you're out, you're done. Now, that's easier said than done. In some players' cases, being left out is the end of their career. But in general, philosophically, getting people to appreciate that it isn't that binary cliff edge, I think, is helpful. So that's one bit of advice I'd give. A good example would be someone could get a bit of a taste, struggle, and they might get left out. Rather than saying they've been dropped or they're not good enough, as often you might hear people talk about, or maybe they're just not ready yet. And even that type of language of not ready yet is different. It gives the player the concept of, I can come back here, I've got another crack at this. So again, framing and philosophical stuff is key. And then there's a couple of other bits I'll focus on. One is execution is important. If you're leaving someone out, you've got to bloody nail your processes, because even if it's difficult news for someone to take, if they respect the rigor underpinning it, they'll value that. It might take them 5 years to get there, but they'll go, at least they did it properly. So I think you've got to be on point with your approach. Now, we won't always get this right. I'm not saying we're perfect, but some of the things that are important is, the first thing would be is, in some cases, remember you're delivering news that's traumatic. And actually, what do we learn from people who deliver news through trauma? Well, there's some lessons in that. So one of the things we've tried to do is, if we're leaving someone out and it's going to be really difficult and contentious, firstly, you just deliver the news. You try not to give reasons, just deliver the news so someone understands the news, and then give them some decompression time. Speak to them again the next day or 2 days later when they've got rid of some emotion. And that's maybe when you start to explain rationale and reasoning, because that's when their brain can access it. If you try and do that first up, they can't go there. Like, it's a bit like someone being told they've got something wrong with them medically. They get home and they can't remember what the doctor told them. Well, it doesn't land. So try and think of it as you're delivering traumatic news, I would say, and do that follow-up. And if you can do the follow-up, do it face-to-face, get in person, be brave enough to get face-to-face with that, I'd say. And then if there's somebody that you want to reinvest in that might re-emerge, so it's that not ready yet and they want to bounce back, well, you've got to be really clear on the reason for deselection. You've got to communicate that clearly to them and their counties. And then you've got to provide support where it's necessary to try and get them back. And that's where I have a team of coaches that I then deploy as resources that would work on a player to try and get them back. And we've got some good examples of that. In fact, one of the case study examples we'll go through, Dominic Bess, he's living through a version of that now, and I'm trying to support him through that. And he's showing, a remarkable amount of resilience. And I think it's because, a bit like you said, Craig, when we were talking off air, that he's been a part of the whole journey so far. He's helped shape his program. He's helped shape, direct his development. And I think that helps him get his head around some of the things he might struggle with and he might need help with. So look, quite a long-winded answer, but I've tried to answer that, philosophically, but also practically, and hopefully that covers what the question was asking for, really.
Perfect, thank you, Mo. There are a couple of questions in the chat around, I think you used the phrase, player-led with no constraints. James, do you want to come in with your comments, your thoughts around that, and then maybe Mo can expand?
Yeah, hi Mo.
Hi.
Mo, yeah, I was just really intrigued by, just interested really, if there were any, in that approach, what themes came out from players, how they coped with, how creative they were in their feedback, what ideas were generated by the players versus sort of led by staff. Were there key themes, or was it quite challenging, or were you surprised by what you got back?
Well, typically the players were probably trying to think what they thought we wanted them to say, as players often do. So they found it quite hard, and we had to throw some ideas at them. And I tried to throw some deliberately left field ideas. And like, for example, you might decide the best thing for you would be to develop your leadership and you want to do a educational qualification, nothing to do with cricket. It might be that you want to go to the States and work on your fitness for 3 months and live out there on your own. It might be that you want to, if I get a bit more crickety, it might be you want to go out to India and spend 3 months there and work on your spin bowling with someone who you never worked with before. I just threw, as they struggled, I threw a few ideas at them and they ran with those a little bit. With the caveat of, look, there's no guarantee we can afford to do these things, but let's start with ideas and then we might get to some principles that we can agree on, or at least do a version of something. So yeah, look, mixed success. And when we go into a couple of case studies or 3 case studies now, you'll get some examples of some of those things that we did.
Great, thanks, Mark.
Ralph, quick process question. It's almost certain I'm going to run over. Are we okay time-wise if I do run over a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit will be okay.
Okay, cool.
Do you want to, with time in mind, do you want to go into the case studies now?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay. So guys, I'm going to move into 3 case studies, and hopefully the scene setting that I've done so far will give you an idea of how we arrived at these programs. But if I do these 3 case studies, so Ollie Stone, as I said, he's currently 27. So when we did some of this programming, he was about 25, plays for Warwickshire in England. But if I go through a bit of a background as to how we arrived at his program, so the selection need that he filled for us is that he's a genuinely fast bowler. And if we look at our test, what it takes to win analysis and winning in Australia, he's going to be critical to that. So why did we invest in him? Well, he served that need for us. A bit of his backstory. Well, he's previously debuted for England before we got into some of this programming, but he'd had 2 or 3 difficult years with injuries. And he'd been unable to string a full season together actually for a couple of years. He had significant time lost due to injury, knee injury, and a couple of back stress fractures. We knew a bit about him from some England under-19 experiences, so we knew a bit about the character, but in general, he'd kind of had a stop-start couple of years. A key bit was, how do we engage him? And for each of these 3 players, I'll offer a different view. But in Ollie's case, the way that I think, I was able to inspire him was talking about him being Ashes ready. So we were 2 and a bit years out, and the challenge that we kind of set him and the system was, right, Ollie, how do we get you Ashes ready so that you are fit and firing as an option, no guarantee of selection, but as an option for us to select from going into the Ashes in 2021-22. And this was sort of 2.5 years out. And that really did it for him. He was really motivated by that, and he wanted to be fit and firing himself. And that was probably the carrot that we dangled for him. In terms of what his needs were, and much of this came from him, and he was pretty honest about this, but we were all aligned that he had some real physical work-ons. Fast bowling is quite tough on the body, and he had some real physical work-ons. He wasn't anywhere near the shape that he needed to be in. He had a couple of mobility challenges as well. So, and the mobility one connects to the technical, which I'll talk about in a moment. But also just general nutrition habits were poor, and that was kind of, I suppose, highlighting some of his physical conditioning issues as well. As a general lifestyle approach, he probably wasn't committing as much as he needed to those elite behaviors that we wanted. And some of his training habits were poor, and he wasn't really taking ownership for his program. He's probably waiting to be told. And then technically, lateral flexion at front foot contact, that's quite a cricket term, but in his bowling action, at release, pretty much close to release point or at first front foot contact, he had a lot of side bend in his back, which was why his spine had been under significant pressure. A big part of that side bend, one was the physical conditioning. He wasn't able to maintain that upright posture. Some of it was technical and some of his biomechanics, but some of it was also mobility. He didn't have good shoulder range, so that meant that he had to move in that direction to make space. Well, what were some of the experiences that we put in place, and what were some of the things that we agreed on? And this gets at the question that I was just asked to a degree, but we arranged a fast bowling training camp for him and 2 or 3 other bowlers, not many of them, who had similar needs, and we arranged for them to go to South Africa and spend some time in Potchefstroom and Cape Town, which is a great place to tour. Potchefstroom as a university is a great site. It's a bit like Loughborough University, but in South Africa, great site for elite conditioning. And we had a really immersive block of physical conditioning and technical work out there in the sun during our winter, which was great preparation for him. He was really excited and inspired by the prospect of spending some time with some England players. So as it happens, James Anderson went on that trip as someone who was doing rehabilitation work as well. And we got this opportunity to expose him to James Anderson and spend some time with him. And for those who don't know, James Anderson's our greatest ever fast bowler. So he got some chance to train with one of our greatest ever cricketers. We also got him some time with England so we could get used to the environment and get a feel for things like lifestyle, training habits, player ownership, and all those sorts of things, which I think had a major impact. In terms of the expertise, well, actually, in many cases, we just lined up practitioner to practitioner support. So our S&C coach liaising with the county S&C coach, my fast bowling coach liaising with the county fast bowling coach, whatever. So there was a real strong alignment because Warwickshire are a well-resourced county. So it was just alignment was key. But the specific area where we added value was nutrition. They didn't have a nutritionist, and given his nutritional and physical conditioning needs, we made sure that our nutritionist was all over Ollie's program. And then in terms of programming and communication, I mentioned earlier that Ollie was on one of our development contracts. So that forced us to collaborate quite a lot on playing programs, which was really helpful. We had some guiding principles for his program rather than hard and fast rules. But a guiding principle would be, for example, when he played for Warwickshire, they would use him as a fast impact bowler. So he'd only bowl short spells. And those short spells meant that he could develop and gradually develop his workload capability and his capacity. So that was key. We had some bandwidths of the number of games we wanted to play, working back from the Ashes as well. And then there was loads of formal and informal communication all the way through that process. And I mentioned earlier the iterative nature of his programming. So that's an example of Ollie's, and that had in his case, a real physical, nutritional, lifestyle, but also technical element to it. If I switch tack to look at Dom, so Dom's 23 now, but he was 20 to 21 when we did this programming. He's spin bowler, and the need that Dom served for us is that I mentioned earlier that we don't have we don't have a history of developing too many spinners, and we've got quite shallow depth. So developing spinners is key, and Dom was somebody that we thought could be a specialist spin bowler across formats, but particularly Test cricket. His backstory's probably got more of a psychological element to it, in that he debuted for England in 2018. He was then deselected, and actually I'm not sure we handled that deselection brilliantly, actually, and he struggled. So that's a good example of where we've learned and tried to do things better. He had the other odd scenario of he went back to his county, and the person he got deselected in the England team for was also at his county, and he was second to him at his county too. So he'd gone from playing in the England team to then being second fiddle for England, and then actually being second fiddle to that same person at his county. And that was really tough for him. He'd gone from being an England cricketer to a county second team cricketer. So he wasn't really getting game time. We had a lot of knowledge of Dom from our under-19s program, and also some of our Lions experiences. So we knew him well as a person. To engage him, actually, in his case, it was different to Ollie's scenario, where it was the carrot that we dangled. In Dom's case, he just really wanted to know that we cared, actually, is the honest answer. So actually, the framing for him was, let's get you ready for a subcontinent challenge where we're going to need spinners. Let's get you back in the England team. And actually, I'm committing investment into you because we care. And that made a big difference for him. In terms of the approach to establishing his needs, we needed him to refresh and refocus his mindset. We actually needed him to get rid of some of his psychological baggage, and part of that was allowing him to vent at me, actually, and just listening empathetically and listening to his frustrations of how he thinks it was handled last time, without judgment and without intervention. Let him get it off his chest, and we did that. And then we gave him a good period of breaks, time off for him to reset. That was his request. Technically and tactically, we wanted him to bowl his best ball more often, and that was some stuff around his release position, but also the consistency of his areas. And in Dom's case, as a cricketer, he's a strong all-round package, so we wanted to continue growing his batting and his fielding, which were already strong suits. We spent some time, we sent him out to India to bowl on a spin bowling camp, and a really immersive experience. And actually, it makes sense in Dom's case to talk about the expertise at the same time. As I mentioned, we lined up a Sri Lankan legend to work with him, someone that he hadn't ever worked with before, but someone that really inspired him, and someone that we learned from as a coaching system as well. And he really managed to develop both his mindset, but also his ability to bowl in those conditions. On that trip, we managed to get the selector, Ed Smith, out there, and he observed him. And actually, Dom had a very quick reselection back to England just through opportunity. And he did really well in South Africa. You saw some of that video on the video clip when he was bowling in South Africa. But what we also did in Dom's case was, because he re-entered the England team, we didn't just take that as, okay, that binary approach of, right, he's back in the England team. Even whilst he was an England player, I made sure he came to our Lions tour to Australia, so he could bank the Australia experience, so that when he then goes back, hopefully in the Ashes, he's already got that relevant experience banked. So that's a great example of us not looking at selection in a really binary way, and us allowing players to move up and down the pathway in a fluid way. And then from a programming perspective, as I mentioned earlier, a big part of it was listening. And listening to Dom air his frustrations to begin with, and him really appreciating that we cared. We gave him extended time off, but the key bit was making sure the system was aligned, because where there was any sort of frustration or anxiety on his part, we didn't want to fuel any of that anxiety by not being aligned. So we had to get really joined up around his technical work on and his workload. And Dom has a real high work ethic and propensity to work too hard. So we had to make sure that he wasn't overworking. And with all of that, we had to keep things really simple. And be incredibly patient. And in his case, he's going through some similar challenges now, and he'll re-emerge, I'm sure, and it's remaining patient and encouraging him to be patient. And then my sort of third and final example as a case study, in Dan's case, the need he served was a top order batter in Test cricket, which we always need, but more recently we've needed even more, because we had, I guess, the likes of Andrew Strauss and Alistair Cook retire, and we find it difficult to replace them. A bit of backstory on Dom, in that he's someone who played under-19 cricket and did exceptionally well at under-19 level. After that, he had some really early success in professional cricket. So as he's 23 now, but he was 21 back then. As a 21-year-old, he had a career batting average of almost 38, which is pretty good, actually. But his 2 years before that, he had a breakthrough year. Then he had 2 years before that where he probably underperformed from his own standard. So actually quite an up and down and non-linear trajectory, really strong in the 19s, a strong breakthrough year and performances, and then a couple of lean years. But what we saw from our analytics was that he had a real strength against spin. His career average batting against spin was almost 60, and that's incredibly high. So we saw something in there that the data wouldn't necessarily show out if you just looked at it simplistically. How did I engage him? Well, Dan's a very unique character, actually. He's got a lot of confidence. He backs himself and he's quite deep confidence. So actually it was a challenge. The challenge I set him was, well, come on then, if you think you're good enough, score big and show us. And he really rose to that challenge. And when I say score big, it's not scoring 60s and 17s, it's scoring 120s and 150s. In terms of his needs, there was some questions that maybe people had around his technique. He's got quite a unique way of approaching batting, which I think is one of his strengths, but people question that. But the big part, as I said earlier, was this talent confirmation. Well, go on then, you show us and let's have a look. So it was, for him, it was more a case of understanding him, but assessing him closely. So what were some of the experiences? Well, we sent him out to India on a batting training camp, which was really good. And we got to saw his super strength in practice, which was great. And we could confirm that. We picked him on a Lions tour to Australia, which we thought would be a real challenge. And actually, Dan dominated. He was top run scorer across the whole series. And he was incredible out there. And that really got the selectors' attention to a point where we could expose him to England. The expertise we had actually in this case was understanding him. So our specialist coaches really making the effort to understand the way he went about his business. But most importantly, selector observing him to make judgment and assessment. And from a programming perspective, one of the big things I had to do at the outset was, given his profile and given that he already had quite an extensive diet of cricket for his winter planned, he was due to go and play in a T20 Super League in Pakistan, but we wanted him to go on this Australia trip. So he and I had to have some conversations around what was in his best interests from a cricketing program perspective. And he actually made the decision to not go and play franchise cricket, which was quite lucrative, and to go on a Lions tour to prove to us that he was good enough. We had to stay very aligned on things like technique. And also, I think probably the biggest thing we got right was, given his strength for playing in subcontinent and spinning conditions, we were very deliberate around when we wanted to debut him. And he debuted in Sri Lanka this winter for England, which met his strengths. And that's something we're trying to get better at, is actually you don't always have that luxury because needs can't always be predicted. But if you can debut a player when you think they will do really well, that helps them integrate and induct, instead of debuting them when things are really difficult and challenging. So I think we got that right with him, and hopefully he continues to thrive. So I've gone relatively quickly through 3 case studies there. And what I wanted to do, for however long we've got left, and I'm conscious of time, and Ralph has given me permission to run a little bit over, so hopefully we will do a little bit, but not by too far. I wanted to give people the opportunity to reflect on some of this now, and probably to do this on your own to begin with. So take a few moments and maybe commit to a learning step. So reflect on the stuff I've delivered in the session, and similar to what Ralph said previously, probably try and fit something into one of these 3 categories. Something that I always think it's quite good to get to a point of realization. It might be that I've shared something, or at least encourage you to think more clearly about something. So if there is something that you think more clearly about, try and write that down. Second to that, it might be that there's something that you want to research or explore further. It might be part of that curiosity element. For whatever reason, it might be just because you want to challenge the things I've said. That's fine. And then thirdly, it might be something that you know and you're going to commit to doing differently. And again, write that down. So look, I'm really keen for you to spend some time doing some reflection on that. We haven't got too long, so maybe it's just a few minutes, and it's the first thing that comes to mind. And Ralph, I'll kind of work with your support here to maybe facilitate this. But if we give people a couple of minutes to try and do a quick bit of reflection on, okay, what might I have in one of these 3 categories, and to commit it, and maybe again just fire it through on the chat. And then if we've got the time, Ralph, after that, I'm very open again to take some questions. We can maybe get into some questions immediately after that, but I'll be led by you with timings.
Perfect, thank you. Karen, would you mind opening the breakout rooms? We'll probably just give you 3 minutes in the breakout rooms, everybody, and then put things in the chat. Well, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for coming back. This session will be pretty sharp. And there is a really good question in the chat. I think it was from Rob. Rob, do you want to come in with your question around the Dom Best?
Yeah, sure thing, Ralph. Thanks very much. Mo, thanks very much again. When you were talking about your Dom best case study, you said that after his debut in September 2018, he was deselected, and you thought that you being the ECB didn't do that particularly well. If you had another go at that, what would you do differently?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of bits that I would say. First is, it's fair to say I wasn't performance director then, so I don't want to take too much of the blame for that one. But the obvious point to make is that he, when he was both selected and deselected, I would say the system could have done it better. I don't just mean us, I mean us and his county as well. And it's a difficult one, but the lessons I would take from it is actually some of it might have been the framing around his selection, never mind his deselection. So he was picked as an injury replacement. Maybe that should have been spelled out quite clearly to him in the first instance, that he understood that this was an opportunity with nothing to lose. You're an injury replacement for somebody that was the front runner, and and maybe an element of managing his expectations would have helped in the first instance. So I'm not sure. I don't know if the selection could have been better, even in terms of the way we delivered it, which would have helped the deselection. That's probably one point. And I say that not because I know that's the right answer, but it's something I've reflected on that I think maybe that's an improvement area. I think with the deselection bit of it, some of the things I mentioned on the previous answer around the way that we would have been communicated, thinking about the traumatic element of that, I'm not sure we nailed all of those things. We probably could have done those things better. They're processes we've evolved, I think, since Dom's experience. I also think that given the amount of time that he's now spent engaged with us around things like programming, this time round when he's been deselected or he got left out, he was able to get his head around it better because he'd been a driver of the process. That made a difference too. He wasn't just a passenger with things being done to him. He was a part of it to a degree. And then the big one probably is the connection between us and the county around, okay, so how do we return him? And I don't think we had that conversation properly. So because he dropped out of cricket for his county, and we probably didn't offer him the love, support, or even the specialist support to help him return. So I think all of those things could be improvement areas, Rob, if I'm honest with you. And much of that it's been one of the examples I've had in my head when I've tried to shape how we do that better. And I still don't think we've cracked it, but I think we're getting better at it.
I am conscious of time, and I think Alice might be leaving the meeting, but she put in a really good question about what advice would you have for practitioners working with athletes at a lower level to support them through international club deselection? So maybe not at that world-class level, but how would a practitioner support and the types of resources they might give them?
Well, it's tricky. I'm still going to shift the focus and the attention on the decision makers. That's where the angst and anxiety lies normally when someone gets left out or there's something difficult. So I'm slightly at risk of repeating myself here a little bit. I think the framing is key. I think he was in a young player trying to get into our under-19 squad. You want them to be inspired by that and aspire to play at that level, but you don't want them to think it's the be-all and end-all. It's one experience of many experiences that they could have. And a bit like I said, it might be they're not ready yet, as opposed to they're not good enough. So all of it is framing, and all of those things, I think, prepare the ground for practitioners to then pick up the work and do the work with them. Simply looking at a practitioner level, I would say that it comes back to the basics of putting the player at the heart of whatever. So what are their needs and what can you help them with, and how can you help them return? So I think genuinely going back to what the player needs from you and supporting them in an egoless way and helping them, because ultimately they'll respond to that. So I probably don't have too much more to add than that, Ralph, because it's similar to some of the other questions that we've had.
Yeah, great, thanks, Mo. I suppose a good place to end would just be on a few reflections I've had, Mo. I thought it was a really fantastic presentation, especially there's a theme throughout about trying to get a better understanding of the needs of the athletes and what they want, and inspiring them to take ownership but allowing the athlete to be challenged and allowing some failure in extent, but have a support network around them where failure is okay and it's accepted, but there's a plan to drive forward. I thought that was a really interesting thought, especially then if you layered that with a bit of that triangulation, which you mentioned from the athlete's perspective, the ECB, and then the counties, and trying to get a real good narrative or needs analysis for each of the athletes, I thought was really interesting. But one of the things that I think flowed continued throughout is the importance of that athlete engagement and making sure they're buying into the culture of the whole system, but also their own development. I thought there were some really interesting thoughts, Mo.
Thanks.
So thank you very much for today, and thank you all for joining us. I know we ran slightly over there, but I hope you found it as beneficial as I did, and hopefully you'll be able to take away some of those reflections from today to drive the impact of this, and hopefully inspiring you a little bit to take ownership of your own development and maybe the way you work as well. So some really cool threads. I look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow for Professor Marcia Wilson's talk, and hopefully see you across the next few days. So thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, guys. Thank you very much for coming.
Ralph, can I see some of the stuff in the chat?
Yeah, if you stop sharing, you should be able to see all the stuff in the chat.
Thank you, Mo, and thank you, Ralph, and the rest of the team.
Pleasure. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Mo. Thanks for answering my difficult question as well. Appreciate it. And thank you, team.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. See you tomorrow.
Bye. Karen, do you want to stop recording?